Hi, this is the Baseless Speculation Podcast with Spartacus and Dylan. Now, today we're here to talk about an interesting thing related to a recent semi accurate article. Dylan, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so semi-accurate, for those of you who haven't heard, is basically like the god of rumor sites among the computer hardware community. And so today Charlie Demerjian released an article that says Intel kills off its 10 nanometer process, and this is a good thing for the company. Basically, the article is full of him bragging how he's been calling this since 2016. He's saying it's actually a good thing because it was never going to work, and now they're going to move forward. Um, this story got quite a lot of traction in the media, and Intel released a response this afternoon saying this is BS. We're making good progress. It's untrue. Yields are improving, consistent with the timeline that we've shared in our last earnings report.
Yeah, it's interesting because we've got two sides here that are, at first glance, they don't seem to be syncing up with each other. We've got semi-accurate that's kind of saying very confidently that 10 nanometer is quite literally being killed off. Those are the words. And then Intel saying, no, we're right on track with the projections that we provided recently. And so those seem pretty far apart. However, we think they're a little closer than they might seem. So, and this is not unusual for semi-accurate and working with Charlie. He's a smart guy. One of the things he could sometimes does is, he might phrase something that's technically correct in a way that's a little bit clickbaity for probably views or who knows, maybe just to get a rise out of people. But he's a smart guy. He's not a dumb individual by any stretch of the imagination. And what we're thinking here is that probably the original 10 nanometer is dead, and there's a slightly adjusted replacement version of 10 nanometer that will live on. And so for purposes of this podcast, we'll use some semi-accurate verbiage from a previous article a few months ago where uh, Charlie very lovingly refers to this revised 10 nanometer as 12 nanometer. And so we'll use that for fun, but since these are marketing names, they don't really matter anyway. And so really with that 12 nanometer, it's going to be 10 nanometer with some adjustments, but that's the thing that's actually going to be living on. And we'll never hear this from Intel. Intel will never tell us ever that there was ever going to be any kind of 10 nanometer adjustment to kind of get it working. They'll, when it releases, and hopefully it will eventually release, it'll be called 10 nanometer, right? That'll be the official name. And we'll never, it won't be called 12 nanometer. It won't be called 11 nanometer. It'll be 10 nanometer. And so that's where this is kind of a little bit in sync with what Intel's saying. From their perspective, 10 nanometer is doing fine because it's their refreshed version of that process that is a little bit more technically feasible. So that's how we're thinking that kind of gets rectified and those two sides get reconciled together. And some people might see this and they go, Spartacus, Dylan, guys, are you sure that this is what Charlie does? And there's quite a bit of evidence of Charlie, despite being the smart man that he is, saying things that are factually accurate in a way that kind of, can inflame an audience that might not look closely. My favorite article of that is all the way back in 2012, where Charlie has an article that's titled, Intel slams the door on discrete GPUs. And he goes forward to kind of say that Broadwell is only going to be BGA. It's only going to have, 4 PCIe lanes and all this other stuff. It's not going to be suitable for a desktop part, and the whole idea of discrete GPUs are, potentially over. And that sounds kind of scary for a gamer. Some kind of PC gamer hears that and they goes, holy cow, what? Well, I'm not going to be able to hook up my gigantic NVIDIA or AMD GPU and do some gaming? Well, it turns out that at the time of making that article, it's very, very likely that Semi-Accurate's prediction was true, because at the time, Intel probably wasn't planning on ever making a desktop version of Broadwell. That's not because they weren't going to make a desktop CPU. They just didn't see the real need to make a variant that used Broadwell. It just wasn't going to be materially better than the stuff that was already out there. Now, eventually, we did see desktop Broadwell, and it was a very niche product. You could tell it wasn't a long-term plan sort of product, but it did eventually exist, and it was a cool little thing with the a big GPU and other stuff. But the idea here is that Charlie's saying something that's technically true, but it's being said in a way that's a little bit misleading and can kind of get a rise out of people. And more recently, another thing that Charlie's done is in just last month, he talks about Intel putting out another 14 nanometer server platform. And it turns out that, if you actually look into the article and see past the free portion, it's actually not another CPU. It kind of sort of, the wording makes it seem like that. It's actually more of a dual socket platform based on Cooper Lake, which was already known in the rumor mill at that time. So that's one of those things where, that's one that's a little bit more, if you're just a casual user, you could get confused. But in all honesty, Charlie's probably has a good information, or at least it was good at the time. And it might just be phrased in a way that could be a little bit inflammatory. But I mean, that's really what we're thinking is going on with 10 nanometer simultaneously being dead and not being dead. Another interesting thing to think about is
the Schrodinger's 10 nanometer.
right. The Schrodinger's 10 nanometer. And how is this wonderful process going to be competitive? And so, Dylan, I think you had a nice little write-up on how you think that this process could still be pretty competitive, even if a couple, parts get, pulled out and rearranged into something that's a little bit different than what Intel originally planned for 10 nanometer.
The original 10 nanometer, which Intel presented at a couple different conferences and has papers on, it's denser than the 7 nanometer from TSMC. According to David Shore of Wikichip, his calculations put Intel 10 nanometer at 101 million transistors per millimeter squared, while TSMC's 7 nanometer is at 96. But that's if you're comparing the high performance node versus the mobile node. If you look at TSMC's 7 nanometer HPC, the process node that's going to be used on Zen 2 and, Vega 20 and probably eventually some NVIDIA GPUs, that's actually 67 million transistors per millimeter squared. So that's a huge fall off from 100 versus 67. And the tweak that people are calling 12 nanometer, well, Charlie's calling 12 nanometer. So the rumor mill says that it's really just removing one aspect of the process known as contact over active gate. So contact over active gate is putting the contact over an active gate, and it was used only in certain higher density libraries. A lot of people speculate that's why the Cannon Lake GPU is broken, because it's using contact over active gate, and they couldn't get that to work, whereas they didn't use that in the higher performance libraries that were used in the CPU, only the high density libraries that were used in the GPU. So if that coag, contact over active gate, is removed, you're looking at maybe a 5% decrease in density, and now you're looking at something that's still about as dense as TSMC's 7 nanometer for mobile, but still significantly more dense than TSMC's 7 nanometer HPC. And this density is not the only reason that Intel's new 10 nanometer is competitive. Their old and new 10 nanometer should be using aluminum oxide dielectrics on the M0 and M1 metal layers, and then it should be using cobalt interconnects and vias on also those two, and then using ruthenium liners for the copper on all the other layers, or at least some of the other layers. And those three things are, those are new materials that are going to help you hit higher performance, because that's the difference between when you look at a TSMC node and a Intel node is, one's targeting high performance, the other one's targeting whatever the fuck Apple wants. So I guess the Schrodinger's 10 nanometer is, that Intel said it's canceled, or not canceled, and Charlie said it is canceled. So it's probably, what we're thinking is it's the original 10 nanometer is canceled, and what Charlie's calling 12 nanometer, what I'm going to call 10.1 nanometer, and what Intel could actually call, 6 nanometer if they wanted to juice it up with the marketing, sort of like TSMC and Samsung have, is still alive. It's just the original version was not.
No, that certainly makes sense to me, and I look forward to seeing Dylan's six nanometer hit shelves in a couple years. That and we all know 6 is better than 7, so 6 nanometer vastly superior to all of the other 7 nanometer processes. So that's going to be pretty cool to see. Now, and we're kidding about that. We don't expect Intel to change the name. They're in way too deep at this point. It's 10 nanometer. That's what Wall Street calls it, and so that's what it's going to be called. And another interesting thing, just to mention before we kind of cap off this podcast, is that with a lot of what we do at Baseless Speculation, we think it's important to make sure that whatever we're talking about can be proven wrong, right? So it's important to be able to say, hey, if we're going to make a rumor, it has at some point into the future, in a perfect world, we want to be able to look back and say, were we correct? Were we incorrect? One of the fundamental problems with this is we'll never really truly know whether or not there was an old and a new 10 nanometer, because Intel's almost certainly going to call it 10 nanometer no matter what, and they'll never talk about this. So some of this is a little bit unknowable, and that's unfortunate. But we thought this topic was interesting enough to spend a few minutes talking about, and we hope that the audience enjoys that just as well.